Please welcome to the TEDxHoodCollege stage, Dr. Laura Sherwood.
Thank you. I'm going to invite you for a moment to close your eyes and recall your earliest memory. Okay. For me, my earliest memory, you can open your eyes now. For me, my earliest memory is when I'm around 3 years old and I'm on my grandma's house and I'm sitting on her bed surrounded by pictures and we're looking through a shoebox. And she's going through all the pictures. So when I close my eyes, I can see the images as if I'm looking at them now. I can see the textures, the white borders. I can see my mom when she's a little girl. I can see all the relatives that I never met before. Those images are seared into my mind, not like the academic journals I read for my dissertation. I'm going to talk tonight about the power of an image through my personal experience as a photographer, as a researcher, and through my work with nonprofits. I first started getting interested in photography when it was around 2001, and I got my first digital camera. And I loved the freedom of taking pictures and being able to delete them. And it just gave me such freedom that you didn't have with film photography. Sorry, need to breathe. So one day I was talking to a mentor and I was complaining about my life. And she asked me, what do I like to do? And I said, well, I like taking pictures and I like editing them. And so soon after, I quit my day job as an adolescent substance abuse counselor and I became a professional photographer. And with somebody who has social anxiety and who's very introverted, somehow my camera gave me the courage to interact with people and communities around the world. In 2009, a friend invited me to go to India with her. So off I went to India on this journey that changed the trajectory of my life. When I was in India, it was like nothing I'd ever experienced before. The cows, the noise, the smells, the poverty. It was like the time that I was hired by the newspaper to take a picture of a woman's house that had fallen down because of termite damage. There was this feeling inside. Everywhere I looked, there was an image, but I couldn't take the picture because it felt wrong. Until I met the Tibetan refugees. I was befriended by a Tibetan monk, Bagdro, and he shared his story of walking across the Himalayas. Shared the story of his people walking across the Himalayas to join their leader, the Dalai Lama. This inspired me. So when I came back to Hawaii, where I lived, I started to curate. I took all my pictures and I started to create a call to action. I wanted to share their stories. So I put it out on social media and I did all this, reached out to funders, but I got zero response. So I decided to go back to school. I enrolled in community college. And for the first time in my life, I excelled. I excelled in school. I was the kid who stared out the window, who couldn't study. I failed second grade. I failed fourth grade. I struggled with learning. Until somehow in college, I learned that I was a visual learner. And I learned to use visual cues, which allowed me to graduate with honors. 65% of us are visual learners. And visual cues have the ability to help us learn 400 times faster. 60,000% faster than reading text alone. My research for my dissertation looked at participatory photography. Participatory photography is a method that is used by scholars, and it's also used in community work. And it allows us to use photography to help communities reflect on their issues. It allows us to see communities through their eyes. Different than documentary photography, which is an outsider telling the story. However, documentary photography has allowed us to see the world in so many different ways and brought us closer to understanding different communities. However, it's an outsider. I traveled to London to Photo Voice to learn how to do this Photo Voice. Photo Voice is the organization. So I traveled to London to understand more and to get trained in this method of facilitating and teaching Photo Voice. And it was very interesting when I was there. I learned that we went through this assignment where we were supposed to bring pictures. So I brought pictures, of course, from India to describe a sense of place. And so I sat with another photographer he was a documentary photographer who had worked all over India. And so I had, thought he had a lot of experience. He was going to be the facilitator and I was the participant. So I was sharing my images. And he then started to curate the story from my images. I started to tell him how my experience in India and what the images meant to me to give the sense of space. He then created the story and we went out and shared the story. But his story was very different than my story. He shared a story that he created based on his secondhand knowledge of the Tibetan refugees as a documentary photographer. It wasn't my story. And that's the problem with outsiders telling the story of other communities, is that we elicit our own understanding through our own biases, which can impact the story and the way people's stories are being told. So participatory photography allows communities to represent themselves the way they want to be represented. My research included working with female activists in India, 2 female activists that use visual storytelling in communities in India. Danielle is the founder of Photographers Without Borders, and her work works with communities, bringing in photographers from all around the world to work with vulnerable communities, acting as outsiders. However, she teaches ethical storytelling. She teaches us to go in, to work with the communities, to help support the communities. And Kalki's work works with the transgender community in South India. Her work is very different as a transgender activist, working to share their stories from her lived experience, along with the stories that the people are sharing with her. She has a project, the Red Wall Project. She did 500 interviews with different transgender community members and had them share their stories on these palms of red painted hands. It's a beautiful story, and it's a beautiful example of how sharing other people's stories in the community from their own lived experience creates social change. It allows them to have the opportunity to inform us of their experience. So my work here in my nonprofit, I've used visual storytelling. I've been able to use cameras and give communities cameras. So I worked with youth and seniors predominantly. And so I've done a method called participatory photography and a method called Photo Voice. And so Photo Voice, again, is the method of giving communities cameras, using a prompt, a research question, using a question of, so for me, I asked the communities, what do you need? What does your community need? And where does it exceed? And so these are some of the pictures that the youth had taken throughout our time together. And their stories that they share of what their communities need and where they succeed. One of the interesting stories that came out of it was recently I was working with a group of refugees, and one of the girls shared a picture, and it's just a regular selfie picture of her daughter. And the story, what happens is when you share the pictures and it elicits, so the photo elicitation elicits deeper meaning behind the stories. It allows us to go in and understand where people are and what their experiences are. And she shared this picture of her daughter, and we were having a group dialogue, and she shared that her daughter, I asked, "This is me," was the question. "Show me a picture of this is me." And it represented, and she showed the picture of her daughter, and and she started to tear up as she shared, because her daughter doesn't live here. She's here trying to have a better life as an immigrant. And so it had such a deep meaning for her. And so many times working with my seniors, they shared stories of their plants. They took a picture of their plant, but the plant had a deep meaning for them. It elicited a story, a deeper meaning, because it acted as a therapy for them. It acted as comfort. They could connect roots to it. So we talked through metaphors. My favorite story is this picture was taken by a participant that I work with, an adult with disabilities. And one day we went out, and I had worked with him many times in different groups, doing different kinds of art and different things. And we went out, and I said, "Okay, we're going to take some photography, and I want you to take a picture of something that represents what your community needs." And as an adult with disabilities, he had been in my group many times, and he would come in and he would go off on a tangent, and I couldn't really understand sometimes where he was going with what he was talking about. But this time, within a very short time, he took this picture, and he started to tell me the story that sometimes people assume that they know what people with disabilities need, that they make assumptions. Then he started to tell his experience of being an adult with disabilities, and just because they're different, they need to be given the opportunities to do things their own way. He took the picture and he said, "Just because something's cracked doesn't mean it's broken." And for me, it was the first time with him that I really understood how powerful this method of using photography, using this type of, method with communities, what an impact it can have on letting their stories come to the front, getting their voices heard. It's been used to impact policy, social change. It's been used in many, many ways. And I invite you to reflect on the stories that you tell and the stories that you hear. A lot of times the images that we see are the images that are imprinted. Like I shared in the beginning, how strong those images were in my mind. There's been a lot of studies done of changing the narrative, of changing stories, changing the way we see different communities through images. Using those images to impact our biases can be so powerful. So everything isn't black and white. I invite you to look at the way that you engage with communities. I invite you, if you are an educator or a policymaker, or even somebody who works with